Everybody, welcome to DRTV, our Above the Paygrade segment. I'm your host, Jay Friesen.
And I'm Brian Mattson.
And we are excited to have with us Joseph Thompson, Creative Director, Capital CMG Publishing, out in Nashville. And also, which is the reason we have you on, John, is you're the author of a new book coming out called Jesus, Bread, and Chocolate, Crafting a Handmade Faith in a Mass Market World.
No, I mean, that's just, that title, that you win, John. You win. Jesus, bread, and chocolate. I don't even know what the competition was, but you win.
You win. That's brilliant. It's coming out on It's coming out on Zondervan first week of April, and you can get some copies now if you order through John's website. And we'll give you that website here at the end of the interview because I want you to stay all the way through the interview. See how I work like that?
I see that.
I like that.
Tease it.
So, John, tell us a little bit about the book. I've read it. It just makes me hungry. Makes my mouth water. It's delicious, and it's also enlightening for the soul. It's also a little bit delicious for the soul. Give us a quick breakdown on the book synopsis.
Well, I'll tell you, hearing you say that it makes you hungry, that's exactly what my goal was for this thing. About 15 years ago, I was hanging out in my kitchen with a friend who's an incredible baker, and he was bringing over these breads and cakes and things that just seemed, they were perfect. They were amazing. And that was his business. And I always had kind of assumed that the really, really good stuff was made in some high tech kind of way that, normal people couldn't do it that way. And he explained to me, he said, bread's really only been made all spongy and white and pre-sliced and wrapped in plastic for 50 or 60 years. He said before that, it really was a community thing that was made in the home, that was shared locally, that didn't have a long shelf life. And I started thinking about white bread, and especially pre-sliced white bread in a plastic bag, as kind of one of the maybe ultimate examples of how humanity can take a good thing and just strip everything good out of it in the service of convenience. And it kind of reminded me of the way a lot of us live out our faith, frankly. And I made a comment that night. It occurred to me, I was just sort of thinking out loud, that the church over the last couple hundred years had really taken on the values of the Industrial Revolution a lot more than it has helped to shape those values. And when I started thinking through my own faith, my own life, the way I was living it out, I started to realize that there's a certain set of values that I call sort of the values of industrialism, that are things like convenience and scale and consistency, that are really woven into our American value system in a way that is antithetical, frankly, to the words, the work, and the person of Jesus. And the way I see the gospel lived out and described to me in the Bible, it's very much about community. It's about hands-on. It's about crafting something, working something out. It's not this Walmart kind of prefabricated, go buy it on the shelf at the cheapest price possible, mass manufactured thing. And my background's been professionally been all about music, but it's always been about this kind of fringe underground music. Even now working in gospel music, it's certainly not the mainstream of where the culture is, but historically I've gravitated towards music that was true. In fact, the company that I started when I was 19 was called True Tunes, and the idea was to move away from some of the marketing angles of Christian music and to instead talk about music that was true and that was real and that sounded like it was being made and sung by actual people and not computers. And when I left the True Tunes phase, and that whole story is in the book, I found myself needing other creative outlets, and I started cooking more, and I started gravitating towards kind of high-end, high-touch, high-quality, handcrafted coffee, and I started brewing my own beer and roasting my own coffee, and then not only just what I did, but I started to meet other people who were becoming more and more interested in handcrafted, locally sourced things. And it dawned on me that there's this movement that's happening in our culture is really connected to a hunger, like what you started with, for underlying values like community, values like sustainability, values like authenticity, that are really not the values of industrialism. So the book explores different issues: bread, coffee, chocolate, beer, music, and and it looks at different values under each of those things, and then tries to connect the dots in my own personal story, my own narrative, which is kind of weird too. And it's about my search for authenticity, but it's hopefully done in a way that will pull other people who are on that same journey, but maybe haven't articulated it quite this way yet. So yeah, I guess that's a broad term.
Well, John, I've gotten a good way through your book, actually, and one of the things I really appreciate about it, and I think it's one of the most charming aspects, actually, of the book, is how you interweave kind of your own autobiography into it. You know, you're really just opening up and sharing your journey, and I've found it really devotionally helpful. The way that you're drawing illustrations and connections out of the baker and these artisans doing these things, and you're making applications to your faith. You're a terrific writer, by the way.
Thank you.
And so anyway, compelling stuff. It's excellent. And I did think in the back of my head, maybe the fact that John Thompson has been working in the contemporary Christian music scene for decades might explain his aversion to mass marketing. But I'll just let you comment on that.
I would say that as far as what you first said about my story, that's actually kind of interesting, because that was not what I expected the book to be when I started it. It was really more about, I was doing this from a journalist's perspective, the way I write about music.
Sure.
And I was telling stories through interviews with one of the foremost coffee experts in the world, and with a friend who has a chocolate company that makes some of the best chocolate in the world. And the editor was gently pushing me to get more and more personal. And I had really, my first draft said very little about myself, but she was able to help me connect a couple dots that I hadn't even connected, that really my search for authenticity in food and drink and faith was connected to my own narrative, my own story, and how I had been exposed to such fraud as a kid that I had this hunger for that authenticity. And yes, there's a lot that you can point at in the CCM world and have fun with. I don't know that we need to do that.
Yeah,
it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy
how
to do.
long do you have? No, I'm just kidding.
Right. But I will say this, that one of the things that has always drawn me to the fringes of Christian music is that, and I wrote about this in my first book, Raised by Wolves, about 15 years ago. Even the title of that book is kind of a reference to the fact that the Christian rock was really kind of a baby that had two parents. One was the mainstream rock and roll world, and one was the church. And each parent saw too much of the other parent. They got a divorce, and neither of them wanted the baby, so the baby was kind of left to be raised by wolves.
Appropriate.
And so Christian music is interesting to me because it can be done really, really well. And there are a lot of people who are doing it really, really well across the genres, whether it's music for church on Sunday, the contemporary worship thing. There's some really good stuff. Sure, you can point to some songs that are kind of shallow too, right, but there's some really great stuff going on. Independent scene right now is stronger than it's ever been. There's just incredible artists with no connection to any industry. I work, like I said, mostly in the gospel world now, and I'm always discovering new gospel stuff that is great. And gospel's kind of cool because it doesn't matter what genre you're in, or if you're in a Christian environment or a secular environment, everybody loves gospel music. You know?
Sure,
So,
right. That's an interesting conversation in and of itself. That's an interesting conversation. Why is gospel music accessible to our secular world? It's an interesting conversation.
Well, I'll tell you, and it might actually kind of connect to some of my work on the book, because I think over the last couple of years of working in gospel, I've asked myself that question. I was at South by Southwest, for the last 5 years. This is my first year off in a long time. Everybody that I told that I was in gospel music, everybody from the drunken rock star to the rock radio promoter, everybody loves gospel music. At least they say they do. Mm-hmm. And I have a couple of theories. One is that gospel music is usually about telling your own story, and it's about perseverance, and it's about getting through a challenge. A lot of Christian music, not all of it, but a lot of it has been very propositional. It's been about kind of encouraging people to live life a certain way. And I think that when people hear music or stories or books or whatever that is kind of pointing a finger at them saying, do this and don't do this, they have a different reaction as opposed to just hearing a story. It's the same thing with country music. When you're hearing someone's story, the question is just, do I buy it? Do I believe the story? Is it authentic? A lot of this bro country stuff, you don't believe that stuff at all. It's ridiculous, But when you listen to Buddy Miller's records, you go, I believe every word of this, and whether you like country music or not, that's why everybody loves Johnny Cash. Everybody loves Johnny Cash for the same reason everybody loves gospel. Whether they listen to Johnny Cash all day long or not, whether they listen to gospel music that often or not, they love the fact that these are authentic stories from authentic people when it's done right. Johnny had bad records, and there's certainly bad gospel music out there, but when it's done right, it's powerful, and it translates outside of just the white-black divide. It translates out of genres, and I think that some of the best CCM music, people like Randy Stonehill or Daniel Amos or the 77, some of my favorites, sure. Mark Hurd back in the day, and even current things, Gungor and groups like that, they're not limited to any one niche because of the excellence of what they do and the authenticity of what they do. So I've always felt like kind of a bridge builder between, wherever there's a chasm, I feel like my job is to connect that bridge. And with True Tunes back in the day, it was to connect fans to this rock and alternative music that didn't have any other way to get to people. With this book, I'm trying to connect an element of our culture, whether it's Christian people who are becoming frustrated with the contemporary evangelical machine, or whether it's these millions of people who consider themselves to be spiritual, but not necessarily, they don't want to use words like Christian or religious. I want to connect all those people to the actual authentic and artisan Jesus, because I think that's, and I do it through my story, and I do it through these other people's stories, because that's a lesson I've learned from gospel music, that when you lead with your story and you tell the truth, people tend to join in and sing along.
That's terrific.
There's a thread, and we can, you could probably point fingers anywhere in the world and figure out why things are the way they are with a lot of contemporary evangelicalism. But there's, the Industrial Revolution bred a lot of things, and they did it well. Efficiency, mass scale, a lot of those things. But if you've ever looked at even the way Jesus works in our lives, the way he's worked in my life, Brian's life, Ty's life, your life, John, Jesus doesn't do anything efficiently and quickly and just here it is, and it's going to be done. Like it's a slow process. He takes us through things. See, like you talk a lot about you talked about bread earlier. You're churning the bread, you're working in the ingredients, and that's the way Jesus typically works in our lives. He's kneading, he's adding ingredients, he's bringing other things along. He's using outside forces as kind of a yeast culture in our beer, the beer of our lives. And it's just, and I appreciated that in the book, that the one of the tying threads in all of this is community. And my wife and I have frequently mentioned that there's something about food and drink that brings people together, and we sit around and we celebrate and we enjoy, and that's you spend a lot of time talking about all the things from the chocolate to the coffee is never done in a vacuum in your book. It's always done within community. Where have you seen, what are been the most poignant moments in your journey of writing the book and some of these stories that have centered around that communal aspect?
I really appreciate that you pick up on that, because that's definitely a very passion. It's a passion for me to talk about and encourage. I think that the word community is really being overused right now in a lot of ways. That it's a buzzword. It's like wheelhouse, it's just something that people say because they can't think of it. And community might just mean hanging out. It might just, we can have very cheap definitions for really important words. But I'm not willing to give up on the word community. I think that the thing that all of these stories, all of these different products or whatever have in common is that they're best experienced, created, crafted, and enjoyed in community with other people. It's, as far as a particular poignant moment for me, I had, before we moved to Nashville 8 years ago, so this would be about 9 years ago, I had a near-death experience of my own. I ended up in an induced coma for a few days, and it was a total miracle that I even survived an internal bleed-out thing. And the small group of people that we had surrounded ourselves with in our home, and then the slightly larger church family that I was pastoring and serving. And I say slightly larger because it was a small church as well. But we got to experience the life-giving power of real community when we were at our weakest as a family, when we were at our most vulnerable and our most needy. And this has happened to me a couple times. I built True Tunes, and it was doing really well, and it changed ownership when I was in my mid-20s, and the new owners, it just fell apart. It got just completely destroyed in 1 year. Here I was 26 years old, and this thing I had dreamed of since I was a kid that had done so well was gone. And it was a huge crisis for me. And if it had not been for a handful of other guys in my life that were in that inner circle who really knew me, who spent enough time with me to actually push through my own facades and my own brave faces and all of that, to really get to what was going on and to just weep with me and to put their arms around me. If I hadn't experienced that, I don't know that I would have spiritually survived that chapter. And then that sets me up for the next chapter and the next chapter. And I think that my wife and I both have just become community junkies, where we want to serve the very smallest circle of people that God puts in our life, with our whole life, with everything we have. And then we kind of look at concentric circles from there. And we hope that stories like this, or when we do house concerts or whatever, that we tell stories about the importance of community. And we're hoping to sort of be an antidote to one of the real toxic elements of industrialism, which is that concept of scale. You know, that we kind of have these polar problems with the industrialism that we've all grown up in. On one hand, we want to be a part of the biggest possible thing. We want to be on the winning team. We want to be on the biggest country, most powerful, whatever it is. And on the other side, we've reduced the gospel to me and Jesus. It's this very consumerist, very individualistic, tiny, tiny, tiny thing. And in the middle, we miss the actual body of Christ. You know, we miss the fact that we're woven into this community that really is how Jesus modeled the whole thing. 12 disciples, the 3 that he pulled out from time to time, and then yes, the 70, and then it's good for things to grow, and it's good to speak to large crowds, and it's great. There's some things that big numbers of people can do much more effectively than small numbers of people. But when we don't really consciously sit and realize that we've either got this mega Christianity or this micro Christianity, what we need is this essence in the middle, this small group, 3 to 12 people, and we don't isolate ourselves. We're still in a church. We still serve at a church. We love to lead worship at church. I love to speak. But our primary focus, our number one priority, is our family. And our family, actually, it's kind of a loose term. It's my wife and I and our 4 kids, but it's also that small group that's right around it. We're just very committed to that. So I hope that anybody reading the book will get a hunger to be a part of that kind of community if they're not, or will get an appreciation for that kind of community if they've got it.
That's great. Yeah.
That's great. The
small group ministry, for example.
Man.
You know,
our small group is, I mean, it's funny that, you know, we're talking about this sort of small group aspect in context of your book, John, because one of the things we do at our small group is the first half hour is we just kind of mill about over cheese and bread, and it's usually, you know, more artisans, craft stuff, and beer and everything else, which leads me to my next question. You have an entire section in your book on beer, and that's how we met. Is over a beer documentary I did, but it's not in the title of the book.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. I have a feeling Zondervan had something to do with that.
Okay. Hold on. This is the absolute truth. If I had wanted that in the title, it would have been in the title.
All right, good.
The working title that I had been using for 2 years was Bread, Coffee, Chocolate, Beer, and Jesus. Somebody very much smarter than me from a marketing perspective said that's too many words, and 90% or more of the people who see this book are going to have to remember what it's called and go on their computer and type it into either Amazon or whatever. And they're going to go, did it start with bread or did it start with beer? Or, like, whichever thing jumped out at the most.
Right.
And so I thought, well, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Then we talked about the fact that the beer thing, it's interesting. I hope that the talking about beer is in balance with the rest of the book, that it's just another example. And in fact, the value that I explore in talking about beer is discernment. And I think that if somebody was to really read that chapter, whether they were pro or anti-alcohol, whether they had a drinking problem themselves or didn't, if they actually read the chapter, they'll see some really interesting, I hope, and funny stories, and they'll get that the point about that is about discernment. If it's just in the title, what you do is you kind of eliminate a whole number of people who I'm really hoping would read that chapter, but they might go, oh, that's just going to be some, argument about why it's okay to drink, and that's not what it is. So it was a result of some conversations, but I'll tell you, there were people with the publisher that actually wanted it in there because if beer was in the title, it would be more controversial maybe, and that generates buzz and all that stuff. So no, there was definitely not Zondervan saying don't call it that, but as I heard smart people make arguments either way, and I prayed about it myself, I thought, I don't want to make that the hill to die on.
Right.
I'd rather some people who don't think they're interested in beer read that chapter and go, well, that was an interesting story.
Yeah, so in other words, that title was birthed out of wisdom.
In the context of community.
In the context of community.
With
Absolutely.
discernment.
Yeah, well done. Well
now
done.
tell me about your infamous cocoa bourbon milk stout.
Okay, so
because I see a bottle on the shelf behind you there.
Oh yeah, where is it? Yeah.
Yep, there you go. That's it. Yep.
This is actually, I made this for some of my coworkers for Christmas. I made these labels. Usually I don't take the time to label my bottles.
I like it.
That's cool.
So I kept this one. So I've been brewing for several years, and I've done all kinds of different beers. But this milk stout is an interesting beer because it uses lactose in addition to the other malt and the other things. You put a little bit of lactose in it, and lactose is interesting because it's a sugar that's very mild. It comes from milk, and it's a sugar that's not fermentable, so it doesn't increase the alcohol level, but it gives the beer a real smooth, what they call mouthfeel. So I was doing this milk stout. It's actually patterned after a left-hand milk stout, which is one of the best milk stouts you could ever find. But then I've got the friend that I talked about in the book in the chocolate chapter, Scott Withrow. He owns Olive and Sinclair Chocolates. And Scott, so there's a whole story about his life in the book as well. Well, Scott he's an inventor with chocolate. He's always kind of riffing on things and trying new stuff. And a few years ago, he got some bourbon barrels from a local distiller called Corsair right here in Nashville. And he took cocoa nibs and he stored them in the bourbon barrel so that they became infused with sort of the smell and the essence of bourbon.
You're just absolutely. I'm sorry, but I'm sorry. I sat there listening to this for the longest time, and you're just killing me.
This is exactly what I want to talk about.
First of all, I want a used bourbon barrel. Okay. Yeah. And now I want chocolate that's been infused with bourbon.
I did when I was down in Nashville a couple weeks ago visiting John, and I went out to breakfast with some mutual friends of ours, and we're standing in line for breakfast, and she's like, "Oh, if you want it, take something back to your wife. Get some of this chocolate. It's locally made. It's really delicious."
Oh, yeah.
And go, fantastic.
Right.
So I'm on the plane on the way home, and I'm reading through the chocolate chapter. Yeah, I'm reading through the chocolate chapter, and I'm like, oh,
I just bought some of that.
No, I didn't know. I was like, oh, please tell me this is the chocolate I bought. Oh, please, the Southern artisan. Please let this be. Because once you hear the story, you want to try it.
Sure.
So yeah. Anyway, it was Olive and Sinclair, and it was a caffeinated coffee chocolate coffee that we had at night, and my wife was up for hours, but we had it over wine. It was delicious.
Okay, so we're back to
the cocoa bourbon.
The cocoa, the chocolate in the bourbon barrels.
Cocoa nibs.
Yeah, the nibs in the bourbon barrels. That's where you were. What did you do with them?
Well, I just, kind of experimented, and I made a batch of milk stout, but in the last 30 minutes of the boil, I took Scott gave me some of the actual cocoa nibs that he makes this cocoa bourbon brittle with, and I just tried to see what it would be like, and it blends so well because the milk stout's got that sweetness, so you don't, with chocolate, it's not sweet unless you add sugar to it. Right. So the milk stout has enough sweetness that with just a little bit of the essence of the cocoa in there, you can really taste it, but not in that kind of yoo-hoo weird way that some other people have done chocolate beers. Right. And the bourbon thing is just a real tiny
subtle
because it's just a real subtlety. I've done versions of it where I've also included some coffee that I roasted in it, so it was a coffee cocoa bourbon stuff. I tried. I actually did get a bourbon barrel from Corsair that Scott had used for the nibs. So now it had 4 months of chocolate stored in it, plus the bourbon. And I poured a batch of beer to try and age the beer in the barrel itself, and it started leaking all over the place. So I still have the barrel, and I'm going to try it again because I heard that you have to fill it with water and let the wood expand.
Yeah, exactly. It's
man,
it's not like you just pick up your phone book and say, "Oh, I need a Cooper." You know,
exactly. Right. And if you want to come to town in April, late April, Phil Keggy's asked if he would be allowed to, which was insane. Of course he is. He's going to come and play at our house, and we're going to do a little private house concert with Phil Keggy. And my latest batch of Cocoa Bourbon Milk Stout will be tapped at that party. So
you're talking to one of the world's biggest Phil Keggy fans.
Yeah. Right, well, I'm going to actually look up my calendar. You said this is in April.
We will stream it online.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
What you're saying, John, is that everybody can sign up for orders of your beer on your website. They can go to, and then you'll ship them beer. And then you'll broadcast Phil Keggy. They can drink your beer. They can drink your beer while they're watching Phil Keggy streaming from your house concert. This is what I'm hearing, right?
No.
No. Okay.
Okay. Well, I tried. I tried.
There's a little. What I am going to do though is because you can get the book anywhere, but I'm selling some directly and signing them, and then I've got some chocolate bars from Olive and Sinclair, and I'm making some cool coffee mugs and some beer glasses and stuff. So I'm selling that stuff direct, and then I'm going to take a certain number of people, just as many as I can randomly find that we can fit in, and give them a chance to come to the house concert, because obviously we got limited space. But we're doing an event, a bigger public event at Black Abbey Brewery, which is the place that's also talked about in the book, on March 30th. So that'll be the Nashville kickoff for it. And then I go to Chicago, and I'll be speaking in a lot of different places, doing a whole tour in Chicago. And then later in April, we'll do the house concert with Phil. And
that's true.
I'm making some pear cider too. We'll see how that turns out.
Now, where can people get dates for your tour and put
everything will be at JesusBreadChocolate.com.
JesusBreadChocolate.com. And that's the website where they can special order signed copies of the book now.
Yep.
And as you said, coffee mugs and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I want to say this interview doesn't do the book any justice whatsoever. Because reading through the book, you're like, you go into so much, and I don't use this word lightly. You go into so much rich detail on the history of chocolate, on the history of coffee, and so you're kind of reading through this going, I feel like I'm reading a half history book on food, like the history of the world in 6 glasses or something, but you're reading something that's written by a Christian with an intentional emphasis on the faith. But I felt like I needed to just make a bunch of mini documentaries and go, let's go watch him make chocolate. And I want to see those two old Mexican ladies, wrapping the bars.
Yeah. That's the genius of the book. And you obviously did a lot of research, and again, tied in with the personal stories. Really, really excellent read.
I've been writing about music my whole life, and we're not sure who said it first. I thought it was Blaise Pascal, but somebody said it was Elvis Costello, and those names sound kind of similar. But somebody said that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And I love that phrase when I was a kid, because it is kind of absurd to write about music. You need to hear music to really appreciate it. Yeah. But it's important to write about music because, again, that community aspect, we're not all in the same room at the same time. And so when I write about like a new Sufjan Stevens record that I just reviewed today, when I write about that, it's a conversation starter, and it's going to introduce some people to some new music. I think that the reason the sort of historical bits showed up the way they did is I kind of treat each of those subjects, whether it's beer or coffee or bread, chocolate, I tell the background the way I would is if each of those were a character in the story. So you get to hear the backstory of chocolate. And the thing is, there's a whole lot of great metaphors that I don't have to connect all those dots. They're there if you want to see them. But the story of coffee and how it went from this kind of mystical, strange, very spiritual thing to being this mysterious brown powder in glass jars or plastic bags, or chocolate, being literally called the food of the gods, and this whole myth about it being stolen from a tree in paradise and smuggled to Earth and all this stuff. And then it turns into this cheap, waxy, bad stuff that you buy at a gas station. The bio of each of those things was important. And that goes back to the idea of how that was the only way I could really find to weave my own story. Is that each of those is a character too, and they have a story. And all of our stories are about trying to rescue the truth from the clutches of industrialism and commerce. I hope that's the thing I was the least sure about, because it does kind of go from biography to history to memoir and back again. So yeah. I'm glad to hear that you guys like it.
It's just written in an engaging way. I mean, I don't feel like it
it
doesn't get tedious. It doesn't get tedious or dry. It just seems very fresh.
And they're seamless. All those things just wove. And I read part of it I had Molly read the section. My wife, I had her read the section on chocolate before she ate the chocolate bar. Because it makes you appreciate, cool. When you hear the story behind something, it makes you appreciate it more.
Exactly.
And so she read that. She's like, I think I'm going to read the whole book. I like food books. It's not a Christian book. It's not a Jesus. It's a food book.
Well, with a lot more woven in.
It is. Yeah. It is a lot more woven in. John, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. It's always a pleasure hanging out with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Again, where can people go to order your stuff?
Well, after April 7th, it'll be everywhere. Before then, you can go to JesusBreadChocolate.com. You can order it directly from me, or you can see the links to, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all those places.
Sure.
But we're taking pre-orders, and we'll be shipping those out. So you'll get, the other thing is, if you order it from me, you'll get a digital copy right away. We'll send you a PDF so you can start reading it even before you get the actual book and all the swag and stuff like that. So. Yeah.
Very cool.
Excellent.
Very cool. Well, thanks.
Spread the word. Tell all your friends, because it might be Zondervan, but this is really about word of mouth, and it's really just like being in an indie band. It's like I got to go do as many gigs as I can and hope that people tell their friends that we're okay.
All right. Well, you got the attention of Dead Reckoning Nation now. So
delicious.
All right.
Delicious. It's the only time you want to eat paper.
That's right.
Well, John, thanks so much for coming on our show. John Thompson, Creative Director, Capital CMG Publishing, author of Jesus Bread and Chocolate, Crafting a Handmade Faith in a Mass Market World, coming out on Zondervan soon. To follow us on Dead Reckoning, you can go to deadreckoning.tv. We have all our links to social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're not cool enough to be on Netflix or Amazon, and that's fine because we're better than they are. Anyway, not really. Share us with your friends, like us, tell everybody about us, tell everybody about John and his book. That would also be awesome. To follow me on Twitter, Jayfriesen, Jayfriesen.
I'm at Brian G. Mattson.
And Tyrell Rosine, Alexander Tyrell Rosine is on Twitter at TY_Rosine, Rosean. So check him out. He's fun. He's super fun. Aren't you, Ty?
I'm fun.
Ty's fun. He's fun. All right, with that, I'm Jay Friesen.
I'm Brian Mattson.
That's John Thompson, and this is DRTV.